Hello and welcome to the Brittle Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast is number 1341. The topic is training, and the title is, What's the Best Rep Tempo? Pretty good question. I hope so, at least. That's why we're doing a podcast about it. But to help today's podcast, I would like you to also listen to podcast number 220. So that's way back when. If you have trouble finding that one, just shoot me an email, brittleironjim@gmail.com, and I'll send you the direct link. I'm also in the process of trying to figure out how to put direct links for all the individual podcasts on our website. That has turned out to be way more work than I thought it would be. So it'll get done eventually, just probably not anytime soon. But if you do need access to any older podcasts and you're having trouble finding them, just shoot me an email, brittleironjim@gmail.com. So podcast number 220 is a training podcast titled Muscle Intention versus Movement Intention. And the reason why that'll be helpful is it talks about kind of whether you're doing an exercise because you want to feel the working muscle and kind of create muscle damage to the tissue. And that would be, for example, if you're trying to build the tissue or shape the tissue. Whereas movement intention would be as you really just want to be good at the movement. You're not focusing on an individual muscle as much as you're focusing on like a pathway. So that would be like a squat or a bench press or a deadlift or an Olympic lift. If you're doing, a barbell squat, you're not focusing on what one muscle is doing through the entire full range of motion. You're focusing on the movement feeling efficient and all of the muscles involved being balanced in their activation and usage throughout the exercise. So a muscle intention exercise is different than a movement intention exercise. The reason why that's important is when you're talking about rep tempo, if you're trying to be explosive, doing a movement intention exercise, then this whole podcast doesn't really apply. So I want you to know that up front. So what we're really talking about today is rep tempo is regards to the speed in which you would perform a repetition, and it's going to be with the intention of it being an exercise that you're trying to create muscle damage or muscle stimulation. So the muscle intention is the kind of the focus of what we're talking about today. So when we talk about a repetition of an exercise, a rep tempo, so if I pick up a dumbbell and I move it, let's say bicep curls. If I do 10 curls, that's 10 repetitions. Repetitions is a long word, so people just say reps. So they would say 10 reps. In each part of a repetition, there's actually in each repetition there are parts. Better way of saying that. Within a repetition, you have the concentric, which is when the working muscle is contracting. And if we stay with the example of a bicep curl, that would be when you're lifting the dumbbell up, or the cable or handle or whatever it is. So we'll say it's a dumbbell. When I'm curling the dumbbell up to the top of the movement, that's the concentric. That's when the working muscles are contracting. Then at the peak contraction, you could do an isometric hold. Isometric just means the muscles are flexing, but there's no movement happening. You can do an isometric hold in any part of the full range of motion. So if I can stop the dumbbell in the middle of the range of motion and flex the muscle but not have it move. That is an isometric hold. So all isometric means is I'm flexing the muscle is under tension, but it's not moving. Where a concentric means it's contracting. So you would do the concentric phase. You could do an isometric hold at the top if you wanted. I'll explain why you would or would not here in a second. And then you have the extension, the eccentric portion of the lift, which is when the working muscle is extending under weight load. And that would be when you're lowering the dumbbell back down. And then you could also do an isometric hold at the bottom under muscular activity or do a full release. This is going to sound probably complex, and I've probably already confused everybody, but I want you to know that there's more than just the concentric and eccentric. First of all, I want you to know what those are, and then I want you to know that those are not the only things. So, a bicep curl, when you're contracting the muscle, that's the concentric. When you're extending the muscle, that's the eccentric. So, C and C, concentric contraction. E and E is eccentric, is when you're extending. So, kind of easy to remember. So the concentric phase, then the eccentric phase, and then you could do kind of pauses or holds in between. So you can pause at peak contraction, or you can pause at peak extension. Why would somebody pause at peak contraction? That's typically when you're trying to build mind-muscle connection. So if I want to learn how to feel a muscle, so I can mentally think of just that muscle and have just that muscle take the brunt of the effort. So I'm trying to improve my ability to mentally find and target an individual muscle. I would want to flex and do an isometric hold at the peak contraction. That does help increase my muscle connection. Also, if somebody's doing injury rehab, if you're doing injury rehab, there are various scenarios in which contracting, like when you have full contraction, you would flex harder and harder to try to feel the tissue and also to work the tissue's integrity. And in a way, it's a safe way to add extra stress load to a muscle tissue, but it's safe because you're not moving the weight load, so you're under less risk of injury. So there's various times you would do that. Now, why would you do an isometric hold at peak extension? And that's typically just going to be if you're trying to catch your breath in between a rep, or you're doing a technique called rest pause. You probably don't want to do that too often because it does cut down on the time under tension of the muscle. So if you go to a full extension and just relax, the muscle's relaxing. The whole point of all of these movements, like what we're talking about a repetition is for muscle intention. We're trying to damage the muscle. We don't want to let the muscle actually relax. We want to keep it under tensional load. We want to keep it under stress. So you're probably not going to pause at full extension. For most people, they do the contraction, they do the eccentric, and they don't usually pause at either kind of end of the movement. And that's okay. So it's pretty special scenarios that you would do those, and it's okay if you don't do it on a regular basis. Okay, now that we got all that out of the way, we're going to talk further on here about the concentric and eccentric portions. The concentric portion is the contraction of the muscle. That's pretty much the full capacity of what the muscle can do in regards to its strength to move a weight. But what's interesting and kind of neat to mention here is the eccentric phase of a movement, so the extending under weight load. Our muscles are actually stronger doing that. So our muscles are stronger to resist stretch than they are to create contraction. So it's kind of interesting. And there's estimates about, like, roughly the muscles are about 110% of contractile strength during the eccentric phase, blah, 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 blah. It just means your muscles are a little bit stronger to resist eccentric like stretch load than they are to create contractional load. What's interesting, though, and this is fun, more conversation here, at least it's fun to me, is our muscles are actually designed to contract. The ways in which muscles interlock and then create contraction, their muscle tissues are designed for contraction. So they're very efficient when it comes to contraction. However, they're not designed super well for eccentric loading. So stretching under tension, which is interesting because even though we're stronger at it, that's actually when most of the damage happens. So most muscle damage when you do like repetitions happens during the eccentric phase, not as much during the concentric phase. So if the eccentric phase is when most damage happens, this leads to the point of the podcast, like about who knows how long into it, is should we extend the time in the eccentric phase? So if that's when most of the damage happens, should I go slower during the eccentric phase to get more damage? Great question. That's the question of today's podcast. What's the best rep tempo? Now, as fun stuff, I used to teach at a local university. I taught exercise physiology labs and some other classes, including weight training and whatnot. And part of my degree, I have a health and phys ed teaching certification. I have a master's in human nutrition. And part of all of that education and teaching experience, I read a lot of studies. So like peer-reviewed college, studies and things like that. There's really neat things to learn. You can get lost in the science and absolutely make no progress whatsoever, but also people will bang their heads against the wall in the gym, not understanding the science of things. So it's helpful to have both formal education and experiential education, and I've been very blessed to have extensive of both. So one of the studies that I've read was a study where they actually timed eccentric loading, like eccentric phases, and then they analyzed whether that created more muscle damage by doing an extended phase. So the study did a 2-second eccentric versus a 4-second eccentric. Now, if you ever try to lower a weight for 4 seconds, like do a bicep curl and lower it for 4 seconds, that's actually pretty damn slow, and that's pretty stressful. So 4 seconds is actually a pretty damn long eccentric. 2 seconds is actually longer than what probably most people spend during the eccentric, and it's fun because they use that as like a baseline, but yet that's still better than what most people do. So what they found was there's pros and cons. A 4-second eccentric resulted in total longer time under tension. And what this means is, if I'm doing repetitions, and say I get 4 repetitions, but for all 4 repetitions I do a 4-second eccentric versus a 2-second eccentric, well then, no kidding, I'm going to spend longer doing those 4 reps. But what was actually interesting was they went to failure. So they just didn't compare, X number of reps at 4 seconds to X number of reps at 2 seconds. That would be very common sense then. You wouldn't need a study to tell you that the 4 seconds are going to take longer. But what they found was, if you do an exercise to muscular failure, and this is within like normal kind of bodybuilding ranges of time under tension. So if I do an exercise to failure, since I'm spending longer time during the eccentric phase, which is actually the stronger phase, my muscle can last longer before it goes to failure. It's kind of neat to hear that. But in contrast, if I go to failure with a 2-second eccentric, I might not have as much time under tensional load, but I'm going to have more eccentric phases, because what they found was you can do more repetitions. So one group, if they did a 4-second eccentrics to failure, they might have only gotten 4 reps. Whereas the group that did 2-second eccentrics, they might have gotten 6 reps. So the slow group had longer time under tensional load, but the faster group had more eccentric phases. So they had more moments when the muscles are getting damaged, and the other one had more damage per moment. Which is better? Do I want longer eccentrics with less repetitions, like less total number of eccentrics, or do I want shorter eccentrics but more total eccentrics? What they found is there's no significant difference. So yes, you've been listening to me for 13 minutes and 13 seconds, and I just told you that it makes no difference. Now that's sad. I understand that, and I don't mean to be a big fat jerk. But what I think is interesting about this is, it makes sense, and it frees us. And I'm going to keep talking here in a second, but it frees us from the concern of whether we're doing every damn little nuance perfectly correct. What's more important is that you lifted weights. You did it. Well, you did a 4-second eccentric, 2-second eccentric, 1.5 or 3.2. Who gives a crap? It doesn't make much of a difference. To me, that is very freeing, because I don't have to worry if I'm wasting my time or if I'm quote-unquote doing everything wrong. The real main assumption is just that you control the eccentric phase. So, if there's little to no control of the eccentric phase, then you're not going to get very much muscle tissue damage. Therefore, you're not going to get muscle tissue, shape change or growth depending on your nutrition. Now, this kind of makes sense if we look at certain lifts. Let's look at, for example, like Olympic lifters. If I'm doing a clean and jerk, they have an explosive contraction. They do an eccentric in like kind of the catch phase when they drive the bar off the floor. And then when the bar's coming up, they squat down kind of underneath it. And then as the bar comes down, they have to eccentrically stop the bar and then contract to drive it back up. And then at the top, when they get to the top, they can just let go of the bar and let it drop. So there's not as much of an eccentric phase as, say, a barbell back squat, but there is still some eccentric phase when it comes to the catch of, like, when they squat down to catch the bar. So what's interesting is when you see people who do a lot of Olympic lifts, they will have growth in those catch muscles of the lower body. So glutes, hamstrings, adductors, those kind of areas, quads. So they're going to have growth in the muscles that had eccentrics. They're also actually going to have growth in the upper back, because the upper back, when you drive the bar off the floor, the upper back has to resist an eccentric stretch, which actually creates damage. So it's an isometric hold that is very violently pulled against. So it does cause eccentric damage, even though the muscle shouldn't actually go anywhere if they do it correctly. So what's neat to see is when you do somebody who does a lot of Olympic lifting, they'll have growth in the catch muscles of the lower body. They'll have growth in the kind of their upper back, but by no means would they be as massive as a bodybuilder, right? Because they don't spend longer time and attentions under those eccentric loads. They're going to spend some, so they're going to get some growth. If you spend more under eccentric load, you're going to get more growth. So what's fun about this is when you look at the question of what is the best rep tempo, as long as you're controlled, there isn't a best. Specific time of the eccentric load doesn't really matter. It doesn't make that much of a difference. So what I actually teach my clients is a concept of teaching control, but I let them kind of move at their own speed. So what I do is kind of like, it makes sense in my brain, and sometimes I have to explain it in different ways to different clients because, everybody always interprets things a little bit differently, and that's fine. Everybody kind of learns in their own way. But one common way that I use is if you were doing an exercise and during the eccentric phase, so for example, when you're lowering the dumbbell in a bicep curl, if I yelled stop right in the middle of the eccentric phase, can you stop? Or would the weight kind of fall to the bottom before you could really gather control of it? If you can control the weight and stop when somebody yells stop, even if you're in the middle of the eccentric, if somebody yelled stop, you'd be able to stop right where you were rather than falling to the end of the motion. If you can do that, then you're in control of it. You don't need to go any faster, you don't need to go any slower, you just need to be in control. If you control the concentric and eccentric phases so that you can stop the rep whenever you wanted to, that is the best rep tempo. And that's assuming that you want muscle damage, of course. So, that's kind of cool to know. I have gotten this question before, and I thought it would be a fun one to kind of revisit, is what is the best rep tempo? And there's a lot of really overblown ways in which people write all this stuff, where they'll give tempo counts for each phase. So for example, at the very beginning I explained there's 4 phases. You have the concentric, the isometric hold at the peak contraction, the eccentric, then the isometric hold at peak extension. You might have somebody write 2, 0, 2, 1, and that's the rep tempo, where you're supposed to take 2 count, 2 seconds on the concentric, 0 at isometric peak contraction, 2 count at the eccentric, and then 1 count at peak extension. So you'll see somebody say 3 sets of 6 at 3, 1, 3, 0. None of that shit really matters. Sorry, I just swore. I swear all the time, but that one felt like it wasn't necessary. But it drives me nuts because people overcomplicate everything, and then everybody's worried whether they're doing everything right or wrong. Then nobody has any confidence when they lift weights. They don't enjoy it because they don't know if they're even doing it, and then it's just a whole bunch of anxiety and stress. So when you look through the studies and you analyze this, it doesn't really matter, whether your rep tempo is 2 count eccentric, 1.8, 2.2. Don't get too worried about that stuff. Just move the weight, but be in control. So if somebody were to stop, you could stop wherever you were. That means you're in control. If you're doing that, you're doing freaking great. Just to have fun, lift what makes sense to you. So I tend to be more of what's called a rhythm kind of movement where I tend to move fast. But at any point in time, if you ask me to stop, I can stop. It's just I've been lifting weights for 20 some years, so I'm very coordinated within the movement. So I like going like a little bit like more to a rhythm, a little bit of like, I don't know, it just feels kind of faster than what most people might lift. And then I have friends and other trainers who they move slower than a turtle. Holy crap. So they might take 20 seconds to do 4 reps, and I could probably do like 14 reps in 20 seconds. Now, it works for me. I've gained a lot of muscle over the years. So I've gained over 115 pounds, and I'm actually leaner. I have a lower body fat percentage, 115 pounds heavier than when I started. So I think I'm doing pretty good. However, also those friends that are trainers, they also grow as well. So like I have a couple of friends who earned like natural pro cards, and they move slow as dirt. But it's what works for them. So as long as you're in control, however you kind of feel coordinated and you feel a connection with the muscle, then that works. That's okay to do, and studies can prove that you will still get just as much results. So don't worry about what is the best rep tempo. As long as you're in control, you're doing it right. If you hear somebody make a big stink about that and they have a whole crazy system that you have to move in certain paces here and there, just recognize that they're probably overblowing that. They might just be trying to sell you a product. Don't get too worried about it. Okay, well, I hope this was helpful. I love these kind of questions, and I love things that tell me that there's a lot of ways to, accomplish the same thing, so I can find what I like and what I enjoy. And I hope that you do the same. Well, if you like today's podcast or our podcast in general, please consider sharing it. The more people we share the podcast with, the more people we can help. And that's the whole goal of the podcast, just to help as many people as we can. Thank you to the patrons of the podcast, the people who financially support the podcast. You can give a donation now on our website at www.brutalirongym.com. We have a one-time donation, monthly donation, yearly donation. If you do donate, I truly appreciate it. The podcast is well over $1,000 a year to host. I give an hour to it every single day. So I truly appreciate the financial support so we can keep doing this for free and every single day. So thank you. If you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. If you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything that you want to know, let us know at our email at brutalirongym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.